talk in the next 10-15 minutes. That's the question: are there limitations for fiscal policy in dealing with the crisis? Okay, just to get some orientation, this COVID pandemic is, as Gita Gopinath has formulated, the chief economist of the IMF, a crisis like no other. And she's right. If you compare the economic developments in this year with the year 2009, the year with the great financial crisis, you can see there's a marked difference. So the decline in output in 2020 is in almost all countries much more severe than in 2009. So it's really a very severe crisis. It's all, I think, it's in the history, we have only experienced one crisis that was even more severe than this one. That was a Great Depression in the years 1929 to 1933, where the decline in output was even worse. So we have this enormous crisis, and I think the positive message is that economic policy in all countries has reacted relatively fast, relatively efficient, and this is, I would say, a major difference to what had happened in the early 1930s, where economic policy remained absolutely passive, with the result that the global economy experienced a huge deflation, a huge increase in unemployment. So this crisis, direction of economic policy has been very fast, very efficient, and I think that has really prevented that decline in output was even worse. And if you want to ask how can we describe what economic policy has to do, I think one can say in these early phases of the pandemic with the lockdown, one can say that the whole economic system was set into the situation of a kind of artificial coma. And like a doctor, when the patient is in artificial coma, has to try to keep the system, the organs alive, so that after the coma, the patient can still live a normal life. So the same thing with economic policy, especially in these lockdown phases, where the task of economic policy was to keep the economic system alive, so that after the lockdown, and hopefully when the crisis is over, that economic system will survive this crisis. And so how should economic policy deal with the crisis? So there are what I call the 4 magic T's for economic policy, not only in this crisis, but in generally in crisis. So the reaction of economic policy must be timely, it must be targeted, it must be temporary, and it must be also transformatory. So when you, as a government, deal with the economic system, you can also use this opportunity to try to transform the economic system in a way that it becomes more resilient or more efficient, especially as what the climate is concerned. So, and one can describe this response of economic policy with this scheme where you can see the 3 phases that almost all countries were confronted with in the crisis. So the first phase was, these are the German data, was a complete lockdown, especially in spring 2020. Then we have a second phase, which one can call the new normal, starting after the lockdown until, I don't know, when effective vaccine has been found, but I would say early or mid 2021. This is what one can call the new normal, which of course is anything but normal, especially as we can see now some partial lockdowns in Germany. I don't know how it is in Iceland. Then we have a final phase. Hopefully we reach it relatively soon, the true normal. And true normal means that more or less our social life will be the same as it was before the crisis. And so if you have the 3 phases, then you can attribute the task of economic policy in these 3 phases. And I think in the early phase, in the lockdown phase, what is really important is that the government try to secure the liquidity of the firms in order to prevent the freezing of financial flows, which would lead to immediate insolvencies. And then also in the first phase, but then also in the second phase, it matters that the solvency of the firms is protected, because if you just only secure the liquidity, and this is normally done by government guarantees, it keeps the financial flows flowing, but it does not prevent a wave of insolvencies, and therefore it's really important to secure the solvency of the companies. Then as you go down further from phase 1 to phase 2, then of course the stimulation of demand plays a role. You have to stimulate consumption demand, investment demand. This is a task which is not needed in the first phase, because if people are not allowed to leave their houses, there's no reason to stimulate demand and consumption. But in phase 2, in the new normal, it's really important to stimulate demand and consumption. And then finally, going from phase 2 to phase 3, then also the economical and technological transformation plays a role. So if you use huge amounts of money as a government to stimulate the economy, you can also try to target them in a way that it really helps to transform the economy. And in Germany, more or less, we have the economic policy has very much followed this sequencing. And I can say that in Germany, we had a very close cooperation between the government and economists. I've never experienced this in such an efficient way in my whole lifetime as an economist. So I think that was really a very productive cooperation. And so in the very early phase, we had what was called bazooka in Germany. So very, very comprehensive guarantees for firms, and then also short-time work. I will say a little bit more about that. And then in the second phase in June, we had so-called economic stimulus package with WUMS, as it was called, where the government tried also to stimulate demand by reduction of value-added tax, by a children bonus, by investment promotion. And also already in this phase 2, this package had included a future package which tried to promote mobility, energy transformation, digitalization. So I think in Germany, more or less, we have followed this sequencing, and overall, I would say Germany was quite successful in this, because we have a decline of GDP. You can see it here again. So Germany has a decline of GDP of around 5%, which is one among the best performances that country reached in this crisis. So what is really a very valuable element in the German strategy to deal with the crisis is short-time work. And short-time work means that companies can reduce the working hours of their employees almost even to 100%, and that the loss of the salaries is compensated by the employment insurance. And this has a positive effect that people do not lose their jobs, that they are still connected with their company. But short-term work is, of course, also important as an instrument to help the companies with their liquidity problems. They no longer have to pay wages. And it does also, it's positive on their solvency because they have no wage costs. And so I think that's a really effective instrument. And you can see here that we have here the chart of use of short-term work in Germany. So we introduced it. It was even invented by our finance minister Olaf Scholz in 2009. You can see here in the great financial crisis, we had first spike of short-term work, but you can see here now the huge difference now of the COVID crisis, where we have almost 6 million people in short-term work. It went down a little bit. And there you can see, I think it's quite nice to compare the situation with the United States, which does not have this instrument. And you can see this huge spike in the unemployment rate in the United States, while in Germany you have some increase in unemployment, but it's not so much less pronounced. And it's interesting to note that the president-elect Joe Biden in his election program says we want to make more use of short-term work. He explicitly refers to the German experience, say this is a very good instrument. I think, yes, this is something very good export products of Germany, I think, which can be useful also to other countries. So this very strong reaction of fiscal policy to the crisis can be seen if you look at the fiscal balance of the advanced economies. And here, like the decline of GDP, you can see the fiscal stimulus was much stronger in 2009. 2009, it was already quite a lot of fiscal stimulus, but now it's really another quality of fiscal stimulation. I think was quite interesting is the United States with a fiscal deficit of almost 18% of GDP. And what maybe is quite interesting, I think most people do not know it, the fiscal transfers by the Trump administration to the private households in the second and third quarter of 2020 were so huge that it led to an increase, to a strong increase of disposable income of private households. So they had less income from their market activities, but the transfers were so huge that it really boosted disposable incomes to record levels. So the US has really done a huge compensation. I think probably it was the idea of Trump to do something that the voters would like. Of course, the effect of such huge fiscal deficits is that government debt goes up, reaches almost astronomical levels in some countries. So Japan has now more than 260% debt level, Italy more than 160. And of course, overall debt levels are very high. And so I've here marked in green the 60% of the Maastricht Treaty. And you can see now that debt levels are miles away from the Maastricht Treaty. And when we talk about fiscal policy rules, and I think we must realize that Maastricht has become completely unrealistic. I think there's no chance for Italy ever in lifetimes, not only of my lifetime, but also the lifetime of the whole audience, ever to reach this 60%. Very short look to what's going in Iceland. I was interested to look at the data in your country. I think it fits more or less to the average situation, a strong decline in GDP, -7%. Unemployment rate went up quite a little, doubled. So we can discuss it. I don't know whether you have short-term work as an instrument. A huge government deficit, 10%. And what I found interesting, I must say I'm not an Iceland expert, is that you had such a very low debt to GDP ratio coming down from 80%, which is quite remarkable. And so, of course, this gives you the fiscal space for a high deficit without coming into an area that somehow financial markets might regard as frightening. So the question is, can countries finance all these huge increase in debt levels? Is this possible? Are there limits to fiscal policy? And so there's a lot of discussion, especially in the United States, about modern monetary theory. And this message of modern monetary theory is indeed, there are no financial constraints, at least for large countries which are indebted in their own currency. And the founding father of the theory is Abba Lerner, who has developed the theory of functional finance. And I will very shortly address this. The key insights that he has to offer are 3 points. And I think first message is fiscal policy, its spending and taxing shall all be undertaken only with an eye to the results of these actions on the economy and not to any established traditional doctrine about what is sound or unsound. And I think that's very topical because especially in Germany, many people think we must have a balanced budget, talking about the black zero. And that's exactly, I think, what Lerner calls established traditional doctrine. And I would also say the 60% of the Maastricht Treaty is also a traditional doctrine, because the 60% level was just the average of the EU countries in 1990, and it does not have any scientific basis. I think a doctor treating a patient on such a strange evidence, I think he would be sued. So the second point of Lerner is then, what has the government to do? And I will quote that the responsibility of the government is to keep the total rate of spending in the country on goods and services neither greater nor less than the rate which at current prices would buy all the goods that is possible to produce. If total spending is allowed to go above this, there will be inflation. If it is allowed to go below this, there will be unemployment. I think that's exactly describes what governments are trying to do now. They try to keep the spending at a level that we have, that we do not get into a deflation, that we that we have not huge excess capacities, or in other words, what governments are trying to do today is to prevent an implosion of the economic system as we experienced it in the early 1930s. And so the third point, which is also quite interesting, then says any excess over money revenues, if it cannot be met out of money hoards, must be met by printing new money. And so it's a clear policy assignment. The finance ministers must do whatever it takes. It's also a word used now by Biden. Whatever it takes to keep the economy somehow in balance. And the role of monetary policy in this assignment is to give the finance minister the money, the funds it needs to pay the bills, to avoid an increase of interest rates. And I think what we experience today is exactly this functional finance in practice. And you can see it here if you see the increase in central bank bond holdings relative to GDP, or the increase in central bank balance sheets. And I have compared the period of the great financial crisis, 2008, 2009, with the increase of balance sheets in the relatively short period from October this year to December last year. You can see that overall, especially in Japan, ECB, the central bank bond purchases are much more pronounced. And if you look at the increase of central bank balance sheets, you can also see a huge increase. So I would say more or less in line with functional finance. One can say that the central banks finance all the money, provide all the money that the governments need to stabilize the economy in this situation. So in a legal way, it's done indirectly in most countries. So the governments issue the bonds, the banks buy the bonds for a logical second, and then the central bank buys all the bonds from the banks. And I think this is the only way how to deal with such a crisis. I think especially in Germany, many people complain and say it's maybe not so good idea that the central banks are financing the government, but I must say I don't see an alternative. And that's the only way how we can deal with such a huge crisis. And then we have this situation that the modern monetary theory people say there is no financial constraint for the government. Of course, there is always a resource constraint of real resources, but in the situation as we're experiencing it now, we don't have a problem of excess demand, we have a problem of excess supply. So how has this now impacted on the financial system? And you can see here the growth rate of the money stock. And for countries, for Japan, UK, and Euro area, you can see there is some acceleration of the money stocks. But if you compare it to the overall volatility of monetary growth rates, it's not really excessive. So, but we have one exception, and I think that's the United States, where you really can see excessive growth rate of the money stock, and this has to do with this kind of excessive transfers that were provided by the Trump administration to households. I don't think that this will really lead to inflation, but it's an interesting phenomenon. And of course, with all economic policy intervention is like medicine. It depends on the right dose, and in the case of the US, one might ask whether the dose was not perhaps overdose. But overall, if one asks is how important is money growth for inflation, especially in Germany, people are always afraid of inflation. There is no very direct connection between growth rates of the money stock and inflation. You can see here for the Euro area, sometimes very high increases of monetary growth, but it does not have any impact on inflation. And so I would still see no problem that what's happening right now will have an effect on inflation. Okay, so this is the kind of story of the modern monetary theory, and I think it's interesting to see this in practice. And I would say yes, that's the right way to deal with it. What is, of course, matters if one asks about what will be the longer-term effects of this Corona crisis, and what we can see and what most forecasters expect is that even if the crisis will be over, we will have elevated unemployment rates in almost all countries, and I think this will be especially a problem of low-skilled workers in the service sector, and so I think this is something we have to take into account, that even if we successfully if we are successful in our victory about COVID, there will be negative medium-term effects, and these effects will be concentrated on low-skilled workers. I think it's something that will definitively be a permanent change affected by COVID is that there will be a boost of digitalization, and I think Joe Stiglitz has put it very clearly. He says, because machines cannot be infected by the virus, they will look relatively more attractive to employers, particularly in the contracting sectors that use relatively more unskilled labor. But I think it's not only in the production process, so I think something that will not be the same as it was before. It will be business travel, so maybe also next year, one will realize it's much cheaper, more effective to have such a talk online instead of me traveling to Iceland. Also, I would like to go there, but it's better for the climate, it's cheaper. And so I think these are some hysteresis effects that will remain. So business travel will be reduced. And so that reduces the demand for service workers in hotels, in airlines, catering, restaurants. And also working from home will have negative effects on service providers in city centers. If there are less people coming to the cities, less services will be required. And also, I think we will also have reduced demand for commercial real estate. So I think one of the negative medium-term effects is, what do we do with low-skilled workers who will be suffering on a kind of more permanent basis from the effects of COVID? I must say I don't have a very good answer to this. Maybe we will have to reduce working times, but if people work less, somehow they have to be compensated by the transfer system. So this will be a very delicate, difficult challenge of COVID, and I think it will be difficult to find adequate answers. So let me come to the end. As far as debt and deficits are concerned, especially to my German compatriots, I always use the saying by Roosevelt: the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. In other words, the only thing we have to fear is the fear of debt and deficits. If we get rid of that fear, especially in large economies, thank God, the governments have a huge potential to stabilize the economy, to stabilize incomes, to stabilize jobs in an extremely difficult and challenging environment. And so high deficits financed by central banks are the adequate response to the crisis. And I think what is also important is that Japan shows that high debt levels do not lead automatically to inflation or weak currency. To repeat it, our permanent challenges are these medium-term deflationary effects that increase inequality. And of course, the recipe, high deficits, central bank finance, is not a recipe that is can be followed by all countries. And small countries have difficulties if they are not in the comfortable situation of Iceland with such a low government debt. And so what we will need even more as the pandemic is not finished yet. So we'll need supranational solutions like we've seen with the recovery fund in the EU, but also I think the IMF must be providing a kind of protection screen for the smaller countries, especially the emerging and developing economies. And I think in this situation, it's really a positive development that Joe Biden will become the next president of the United States. And what we would expect, what we hope from him, is a kind of Bretton Woods moment. And Bretton Woods moment means that in the most serious crisis of the years 1944, the global community, except Germany, decided we can only get the global economy back on track if we work together, if you have global institutions, global approaches, and that's what happened at Bretton Woods. And so this is what we would require now also to get the global economy back on track after this terrible pandemic, is this kind of Bretton Woods moment. Thank you very much.